Hi, my name is Richard Sawada. I'm director of the St Kilda Film Festival, and welcome to this special conversation with Gary Foley, Phillip Noyce, and Tony Birch, who'll be hosting the session. Look, and it's presented by the National Film and Sound Archive and the Australian Film and Television and Radio School as well, who we've worked very closely with in bringing all the archival programs this year to you. Now, look, very early on in the planning of the St Kilda Film Festival, we were wanting to present a program looking at activists and activism and youth culture and the representation of youth on Australian screen. And we were looking at works from Jane Campion and Jan Chapman from the early 70s and Phillip Noyce as well from the early 70s. But we're also wanting to get other kinds of voices in there as well. So we began talking to Gary Foley too. And the Australian film industry being what it is, all these relationships kind of cross over and intertwine and are reflected in all these programs with Jan Chapman working with Jane Campion and Jan Chapman being married to Phillip Noyce, and then Gary Foley working with Phillip Noyce in Backroads and other projects and that sort of thing. And then Phillip Noyce also producing a whole range of experimental documentaries and films looking at identity and such in the early and mid 70s. So all these things came together very beautifully. And although we're not able to present them to you in a live context, which we were wanting to do on 16mm film at the St Kilda Town Hall, we're able to bring you this really, hopefully, great discussion between Gary Foley, Phillip Noyce, and hosted by Tony Birch, that hopefully, who knows, will centre around our work with working on Backroads. Now, Gary's been great in putting this together. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what's going to happen in this conversation, as I'm sure you are. Look, thanks for watching. Thanks for being part of independent Australian screen culture. And it's over to you, Tony.
Okay, my name's Tony Birch. Here on behalf of the St Kilda Film Festival. The first thing I want to say before we begin the session is to remember that we're on Aboriginal land for this film festival, and we want to pay our respects to the Bunurong people, who are the owners and custodians of the traditional land on which this conversation is taking place. Tonight, I'm really lucky to be talking to two major figures in Australia in both the film and cultural industry and the political industry as well. And that is Gary Foley, Professor Gary Foley from Victoria University, and the film director and filmmaker Phillip Noyce. Philip's joining us from Los Angeles. What we're here to talk about, of course, is the seminal film that was made by Phillip Noyce, written and directed by Phillip Noyce in 1977, Backroads, of which Gary Foley was a major star, playing a character called Gary. And the film has gone on to be a revered film in the history of filmmaking around and with Aboriginal people in Australia. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Professor Foley, for joining me. I want to start with just a really general question from either or both of you, is that how and when did the Backroads project begin? What was the moment of which you two got together and thought about making this film?
Well, this is a historic moment in the sense that this is the first time in 40 years that I think both Phillip and I have been in the same place putting forward our respective versions of how things come about and what happened. But from my point of view, I was sitting in a pub in Redfern one day, minding my own business, and I got a phone call from some guy who wanted me to read a film script. And like most people who rang me up like that in those days, I said, come and see me on my turf, come and see me in Redfern, because that usually sorted out the shoot from the gate. And to my surprise, this giant bloke turned up at the Cruder's Arms Hotel. Everybody in the pub thought he was a copper because he was so big. But I was impressed with his recklessness. And that was my early impression of Noyce. And when we got to talking about the film, he put it on me. He wanted me to play the lead role, I, stupidly being young and naive, saw visions of myself winning Oscars and going to Hollywood and all this sort of stuff. But in order to make the film, I put it to Noyce that I saw this as an opportunity to let Australians know a bit more about the reality that confronted Aboriginal Australians in rural New South Wales at the time. And from my point of view, I was going to take advantage of the opportunity to maybe be able to get a little bit of a message across in the context of some road movie with this crazy, reckless 6-foot guy I just met. To my surprise, I said to Noyce, listen, if we're going to make a film like this, it has to have some level of authenticity. And I put it to him that two of the place to best possibly make a film like this would be in Birch and Brewarrina, both of which were very tough towns in those days in terms of racism and stuff. And I'd had a bit to do with the people in Birch prior to that. And the second thing that impressed me about Noyce at that point in time was that I said to him, we've got to go and talk to the people in the reserves up there, and you, Mr. Noyce, have to get their permission to make this film in their midst, you know. I said, you can't make a film like this without their consent and without their having some say in the way in which they're portrayed. And to my surprise, he said yes. I mean, not a lot of people did that in those days. And I took him up to Birch, and I said, this is my version. I said to him, listen, mate, I'll organise a meeting, but you're going to get up and convince these people yourself. I didn't think they would say yes. I didn't think he had a snowball's chance in hell of convincing these people. But again, and it says something about the man, they agreed. And to my surprise, I was then suddenly stuck in a situation where I had to pretend I could act. But Billy Hunter sorted that out later. That's another story.
And Phillip, what's your version?
A little bit of overlap. You know, it was a short story by a guy in Adelaide, John Emery, about an Aboriginal guy that gets out of prison, well, out of the lockup. And we see that at the start of the movie. Anyway, I thought, who can play the part? Well, I picked up the Sydney Morning Herald, or yeah, it must have been the Sydney Morning Herald, and there was this, believe it or not, absolutely knocked down, gorgeous Indigenous man.
Who was that?
Yeah, that was him, Gary Foley, 26 years of age, a firebrand, you know, but overwhelmingly charismatic as well. And I thought to myself, wow, that guy, you know, he's a movie star. I got to track him down. So I tracked him down to the Cricketers Arms Hotel in Redfern. I put a call into there, made contact with him and turned up. And, you know, Foley took me on the ride of my life. The rest of it now is over to his story, because that's what happened. It was a ride. It was, you know, an introduction to the reality of Black lives at that time. Not that I didn't know about that, having grown up in Griffith with the Three-Way Reserve just out of town. But I'd never sat down and spent a lot of time with black fellas. Now with Foley, I did that, and that was a privilege. Because I quickly realized that the way to make this film distinctive is to let him, just to follow him, follow the lead. When you said it was written and directed by me, it wasn't. It was directed by me. It was written by John Emery, myself a little bit, but Foley and Bill Hunter really
and Zach.
They really improvised most of the dialogue. And you know, in that sense, although you know there's a white director is listed, you know, it was as much Foley who made the film as I did, because he had such an enormous contribution in the content of the film, in the language, in the dialogue, in the approach. I was a middle-class kid from Warunga in the upper North Shore of Sydney, so I was way out of my depth.
And made the whole thing for 28,000 bucks or something,
But yeah.
Ridiculous.
Just on that question, Phillip, about being a white middle-class kid, and Foley's point earlier about taking you out to Birch and Barorona, those initial meetings with the people on the reserve, how did you approach that, and how do you feel you were received at the time? Because there must have been some acceptance of you for people to agree to have the film made.
Well, I'd made a film about Dr. Archie Kalakarinos, a documentary, a doctor that had experimented with vitamin C therapy to solve some of the health issues with Indigenous people in that area. So I'd been up there before and I'd met some of the people, but I'd never really sat down and looked them, eye to eye. What was your question again? How did
just the sense of there must have been some acceptance of you for people to agree to have the film made.
Well, you got to remember that these people were probably surprised that anyone wanted to make a film that involved
and was prepared to ask permission. That was a revelation as well, I suspect, for them.
So
I've never done that.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky because Foley was guiding me, taking me in. I mean, he got very angry many times with me. Said, "How dare you do this? How dare you do that?" And I just said to him, "Well, you brought me here, mate." The journey was wonderful because it was also a journey into Gary's life, because we ended up at his grandfather's house outside Grafton. No, outside. Yeah, Grafton. Yeah. It's a real eye-opener to me because his grandfather had been in the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into this house, which was a beautiful house. It had...
You're talking about Nambucca.
Yeah, okay, yeah, on the Glennis to Grafton Road. But, I went into this house and it was this beautiful house that was sitting there like a monument to the past, because it was a proud Indigenous family that was celebrated in the photographs on the walls of this house. And that was Gary's granddad, who'd been a digger in the first.
Grandfather. My great-grandfather built that house, and that house has been in my family for 100 years. The man who built it was the man who, with John Maynard's grandfather, set up the first modern Aboriginal political organisation in the 1920s. So it's a bit. I didn't tell you that at the time, Noyce, partly because I didn't know the full story of that at that time we passed through there.
Look, talking about political organisation,
Tony, the point was we went out to reserves, but then I discovered that Gary's life wasn't growing up on a reserve. It was growing up very differently, with a very different relationship with white Australia, and in a very proud environment. His family were landowners, house owners, and had served their country.
My country.
Okay, yeah, it's your country. Served your country. Anyway, had served.
They weren't serving her in the First World War, mate, but that's another story.
That's another story.
We'll go back and argue the First World War, but when they served, they were serving their country.
Now you see the sort of creative tension that I think Stephen Newton spoke about.
Boys,
We'll
move on from Gallipoli. We'll deal with that another time.
Here's the point.
You're not the director here, Noyce.
It was the overturning of my first preconceptions about Indigenous Australians. Gary took me to the reserves. Reserve life is one thing, but what he revealed to me also was that there was another life for Indigenous Australians, which was very different to the preconceptions that white Australians had at that time.
Yeah, that's an important point. Thank you, Phillip. So, the other thing I wanted to talk about just initially here is the film was made in 1977, and Foley, maybe you could lead off, but certainly if Phil's got a response as well. So we know that you're involved in the establishment of the 10 Embassy. That ranges right through 1972. We had the election of the Whitlam government in December 1972, and it's sort of seen as this potential enlightened period in Australian political and cultural life. And then, of course, Whitlam gets rolled by John Kerr in 1975. And by the time we get around to the year the film's made, 1977, Malcolm Fraser's about to go to an election for his second term. So watching the film in 1977, it seems either regressive or certainly that moment, if there was an opportunity during the Whitlam era for change, that it's already dissipated. And one of the things I've always been interested in you, Foley, your conversation, is that these hopes that part of that initial protest movement and that shift of government really did evaporate quickly. So making the film in 1977, what political climate were you conscious of, and how did that impact on the film?
Well, around the time we made the film, I was heavily involved in the politics of Aboriginal health. I was on the national, we were setting up a national Aboriginal health organisation. We were fighting Malcolm Fraser, and one of the throw-offs or advantages of Backroads, as it turned out in the long term, was I managed to con my way to the Cannes Film Festival, courtesy of Backroads in 1978, and that led directly into me making connections with some German filmmakers, who ultimately led us into close alliance with the German Greens at a time when they were in political ascendancy in Germany. And as a result of that, we were able to set up an international network of political support groups throughout Western Europe and in England. Now, all of that came about as a direct result of Backroads, but also the political climate at the time when we were even up in Birch. I mean, you can see for yourself in the film the reality of just how tough it was for Aboriginal people living in that situation at that moment in time. And things were grim, and I think that Backroads, in some small way, played a role in making Australians a little bit more aware about that. But because of the toughness of the film, it wasn't successful in Australia. It was successful in Germany and other parts of the world, but in Australia, Australians found it too difficult to confront. And I mean, to this day, today as we speak, there's a national 10-year survey that's been published that finds that 75% of Australians surveyed have negative attitudes towards Aboriginal people. So the la lutte continues, the struggle goes on, and in many ways we're worse off today than we were back then, but there's hope on the horizon.
Did you want to comment on that, Phil?
Which part of it?
Well, I suppose I can ask a question.
No doubt about the survey came out today. We all saw it. But there's no doubt also that in 1977, you wouldn't get 20,000 people marching in Sydney on behalf of Black Lives Matter. And in Australia, of course, the Black Lives That Matter are the 450 Black lives that have been lost since the last time there was a report about Black Lives Mattering. So, things have changed enormously. There's much past, but they haven't necessarily changed, at ground zero, which is day-to-day life for Indigenous Australians. But certainly whites are more aware and willing to embrace
Can I say something? One of the interesting political historical connections also with Backroads. We made Backroads in Brewarrina. 10 years, a tough town, 10 years before the Brewarrina riots, the famous, notorious so-called Brewarrina riots. And what was the issue in the Brewarrina riots? It was a death in custody, in police custody, of a local Aboriginal man, Lloyd Boney. And that was one of the deaths that sort of tipped the balance and forced the Royal Commission to come about. Now here we are, 30 years down the track from the Royal Commission, and there are more Aboriginal people in jail than there ever were. Things are, and that's why it's really heartening to see the events of the last 2 weeks. I don't know whether you know this, Phil, but in Australia, it's been parallel. In fact, those big demonstrations on Friday last week, the biggest demonstration in the world, Black Lives Matter, was in Melbourne. And those young people who did it are my proteges.
Okay.
Also, given the amount of Indigenous people in Australia and the number of deaths in custody, it's arguable that Australia has a bigger problem than America in terms of black deaths at the hands of police.
And even incarceration rates, the worst, far worse than the African American. They're the worst in America.
So in that sense, although, the general population are more aware, the government hasn't changed. It's exactly the same as back in 1977, as evidenced by the Prime Minister's statement that we don't have this problem here, which he changed a day later once some of his advisors advised him that, yes, we do have a problem here. But nevertheless, first out, he said, we don't have a problem. We don't need this this protest. We don't need to turn out in the streets. This is an American problem. Well, it's not, and it always has been an Australian problem. And as I said, to a greater degree than it's an American problem.
Let's talk about Backroads.
Yeah. All right, boys. Foley, you raised it earlier, but I would like both you and Phil to respond to this, because in the conversation we've had around this film previously is both in the opening scene and in subsequent scenes of the film, there are images which do show the deprivation of which those mob are living on in regard to Brewarrina and Birch on the reserves. There's the relationship between not only Aboriginal people, because we clearly see this through Jack as well, the Bill Hunter character, and alcohol is present right through the film. So one of the things, Foley, that you said earlier is that people having a sense of their negative representation or their negative view of Aboriginal people. I'd really like to know from both of you to what extent you were aware at the time that you wanted to, in my view, show the living conditions of Aboriginal people in a very honest but confronting way, and to what extent were you aware that you could possibly also uphold or reinforce negative stereotypes that racist Australia were used to. So how did you deal with that? What we've seen, to me, an obvious contentious issue in the filmmaking.
I'm pleased that it's still a contentious issue, but at the time and to this day, I still believe that it was really important that people see the reality, not made up sets, not actors. I wanted the people to see the real people in their real situation. And the important element in it all, as far as I was concerned, as long as the people who we were working with were the ones who were in agreement with what was happening, that was the only thing that mattered to me. And I mean, in terms of the alcohol in the film, I read Phil's biography, in which he said that in his biography claimed that he was so new to filmmaking at the time, he didn't realise that you use prop alcohol in films. And there may be an element of truth in that, but I don't think the film would have had the energy and just the power of the film had me and Billy not been partaking to the extent that we did. Even though it almost got us killed once when Billy was driving the car in the truck, in the scene with the truck. Yeah. Billy was pretty drunk. And it wasn't until I saw that scene, I looked at it again the other day, you can see Billy, the shot from the truck, you can see how much Billy's turning that wheel and how close he's coming to that big truck. And because of a $28,000 film, there was no stuntmen, were there, Phil?
No, there weren't, but we could have all been killed several times over in that movie. I mean, those scenes where we're driving along in the outback near Birch, you know, Lloyd Carrick, the sound recorder, is in the trunk, in the boot of the car, because that's the only place he can hide to record. And many times we'd stop filming, which we did when we ran out of film, and we'd open the boot, and there would be unconscious sound recorders, you know, because carbon dioxide or whatever was collecting in the boot there. And sometimes when these two madmen, Billy Hunter and Gary Foley, were arguing and driving with the car full and they're passing a flag and a wine, I, the director, am tied up on the bonnet of the car at the front there. I'm tied up there because that's the only way. We didn't have you know, video recording in those days. So the only way you could get an idea of whatever they were doing inside that car was to be tied to the front and listen through the headphones to what they were saying, and I could see them through the windscreen. And in the back is the sound recordist, and you know, they're driving crazily across the outback. But you know,
it was fun. And
I just on that question, Phil, about the way.
To answer your question,
yeah.
What I believe was that, by the way, the scene where we see the old fellas sitting around passing the flagon, singing the song "Pass the Flagon Boy," you know, that's the scene that at that time was repeated every day in not every day, but at least once a week in Indigenous communities like those reserves. What I believe was in showing that, you know, it was an eye-opener for everyone else, but also I truly believe that in the character that Gary was playing, called Gary, we had an articulate, intelligent, Indigenous man who was the antithesis of all of that, who could see, who had, you know, who could
and in the dialogue with Billy was able to sort of discuss some of this sort of stuff. But
so we had the two presentations, or the two possible presentations of Indigenous life. You know, yes, the people stuck on the reserve in a dead-end existence with alcohol as one of their best friends, and we had someone like Gary, who's the future, you know, and who can achieve anything, who's the equal of anyone in that country. So you know, it was you know, it was, that is then and this is now sort of portrait.
I think allow me to say this, just in terms of the stuff you're just talking about before about Lloyd and others. I think it's important to pay tribute to the crew on that film. You know, Russell Boyd, one of the great cinematographers, Lloyd Carrick, heroic performance in the boot, Jan Kenny, Liz Knight, Phil's mother, who did the makeup for the guy who got shot. Who I missed out on, Phil?
Jan Chapman.
Jan Chapman, yes, sorry.
Producer of the piano, who I was married to at the time, who was the boom operator and continuity keeper.
And let's not forget Kevin Smith.
And Kevin Smith, who was
the late Kevin Smith.
Kevin was really Gary's bodyguard. He was. Gary,
boy, what a bodyguard.
Kevin was a great guy, by the way, but Gary thought that if he ever got into trouble, Kevin would get him out of it.
And boy, was I right.
Just following in relation to
always been relied upon to get us out of the big problem that we faced every day, which was, how do we keep that Pontiac Parisienne going? And
yeah.
kept coming up with ways of starting the battery, pushing the car, abusing me because I'd spent $2,000 buying the car as a prop, and it was shit, I know. And you know what? Where that car ended up? It ended up in the middle of Pitt Street in Sydney, in Martin Place, as a stunt. Before we opened the film, we took the car down there, and I had 10 sledgehammers. And at lunchtime, I invited a TV station to come down, and I invited people all around who were having their lunch in Martin Place to take up a sledgehammer and destroy the car. So the car is
still
pieces.
I'm still angry with you about that. That car today would be worth a fortune, mate. It's a museum piece, a collector's item, and you wrecked it wantonly.
Boys, I want to ask about Essie Coffey, because one of the things that we've alluded to there are the scenes on the reserves and the level of deprivation. But I think Essie Coffey's appearance in the film, particularly when she has the conversation with Anna, where she really, speaks about the indictment of white society and issues of colonial violence. I think it is, for me, the most powerful moment in the film, because even though she is surrounded, and we're surrounded as the audience by these issues of great difficulty and marginalisation, her powerful voice to me really stands as a critique of everything that we see in the film. So I'm interested to get a response to that, how you feel about Essie's appearance and how that came about.
Well, I would have cut her out, except Foley saw the cut when I did cut her out, and he said, "What are you doing? Where's Essie?" He said, "Oh, no, I'm not going to put my name on this film unless you put her back in." So actually, it was Gary who pointed out to me, she's got the strong voice. She's the strongest voice. There's a piece of reality, not make-believe. She's not acting. That's her for real. And basically, he put his foot down. He said, I won't be a part of this. And this is after the movie's shot. Not going to be a part of it unless you put her back in. So she's in there because of him.
And she's in there, from my point of view, because, I'd known Essie was a really strong person. And, what another positive spin-off from Backroads was that the other crew member who we forgot to mention, voluntary crew member, was Martha Ansara, who met Essie during the making of Backroads, and they hit it off, and eventually Martha then went on to assist Essie to become the first Aboriginal woman to ever direct a film, My Survival as an Aboriginal. And that's a film that went on to win the Reuben Manmolian Award, which I think one of your films won, Phil. Carson Pollock's?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there you go.
This program.
And Essie was truly one of the truly remarkable people I've known in my entire life. Her and her husband, Doc Coffey, had 8 kids of their own, and they adopted and brought up 10 other kids. And in the midst of all that, she went on to be the founder of the Brewarrina Aboriginal Legal Service. She went on to be recognised for the great power that she had, and she's sadly missed by me and many others.
Just on that other issue about reception, I'm really interested to know that what we do know about the film is the initial reaction. When you read commentary on the film, they say that the reception of the film in Australia was mixed, in inverted commas, but they talk about the film having a much more appreciative audience overseas, particularly in Europe. Could you talk a little bit, because I know you took the film to Cannes, could you talk a little bit about why you think the film was negatively reviewed initially in Australia, and why in Europe the film was giving a much more favourable reception?
I would say that it didn't have the reception it should have had in Australia, simply because of the great Australian denialism. Australians remain to this day in denial about the reality of race relations in this country, and they don't like anything that sort of forces them to address or to even think about some of those sort of issues. And I think that was the biggest problem with Backroads in receiving getting a better reception in Australia. But I mean, it's still it's still a pretty powerful film historically anyway. Here we are 45 years later talking about it as part of the St Kilda Film Festival. So it's still very much a film that has an impact and has an effect on Australians, and hopefully, I would hope, a positive effect, make them think.
Phil?
Yeah, I mean, it had a long run at the Scala Cinema in London.
Yeah. Along with How Do They Come, Jimmy Cliff film.
Yeah, so it was doubled up there for quite a few months. It played through the summer of, I forget which year, I guess it was 1979. 1979.
78.
78 was it, when it played in Scala Cinema for about eight or 9 weeks. They were looking at it as a piece of Australiana, but also I think appreciating it in ways that it wasn't appreciated in Australia, in as much as it was a mixture of genres. It was an A film politically, it was a B film, story-wise, and it was a C film in the way, it was like a throwaway road movie, in the way the story was told. And that was deliberate, to try and mix genres, was the idea. That was appreciated in Europe. But probably the confrontation with Australian audiences was too great for it to really work for Australians.
The other thing, I think, was that it was released pretty much the same time as the Chanty Jimmy Blacksmith. And the Chanty Jimmy Blacksmith was made for $2.5 million. Backroads was made for 28 grand. And Backroads got as good a reception internationally as what Chanty Jimmy Blacksmith did. But see, the Chanty Jimmy Blacksmith was handicapped also because of the violence of the axe scene, which was ridiculous. And yet the Chanty Jimmy Blacksmith, as I recall, got an M certificate, which allowed it broader audiences, and for all the violence that was there, they got an M certificate, and Backroads got an R certificate, primarily allegedly because of the language,
You got an R certificate?
Fucking shut up. You kept saying the fuck word all the time, mate.
Yeah, but authenticity was the go, mate. Me and Billy tried to tell you that.
Geez, everything's changed. You can see fuck on the 7 o'clock news.
It would have all turned out differently, Tony, if I had known, as I said many times, if I had realised that you didn't use real wine, you had to use prop wine.
That's a lie.
These guys would have rebelled. I couldn't get them to start driving for the day, get out there. If I had given them, prop wine, tea coloured to look like Chardonnay or whatever.
Well, in which case, I've got to tell the story about my acting lesson with Billy Hunter. On the night before we started shooting, and this is my version, this is yet again, I've read Phil's biography. He hasn't read mine yet because it isn't published yet, but
I'm right.
But on the night before we started shooting, we're camped in a caravan park in North Birch, and I go up to Billy Hunter over the campfire to say, "Hey, Bill, I've got a problem." He said, "Oh, yeah, Foles, what's that?" I said, "Mate, I can't act." And he said, "Hey?" And I said, "What am I going to say to Noyce tomorrow?" He looked at me and said, "Don't worry, Foles, just do as I do." And next morning, Billy insisted on a carton of BB or something being on the set. And before we started work, Billy said to me, "Right, Foles, here's your first acting lesson. Help me drink this." And that was the last time I was sober for 10 years. I blame Billy Hunter for that.
Okay. I want to go to something which I picked this up. I did talk to Foley about this earlier, but I picked this up on the latest.
Editing it?
It is a road movie, and I don't know to what extent, Phil, you're influenced by Bob Hope and Bing Crosby's On the Road series, but the one thing that does happen is that we've got a lot of people moving about. So we got in this Pontiac, we've got the crew, and we've got a lot of interaction with passers-by, hitchhikers, trucks, etc. But the one thing that there's a constant stillness in this, Foley, it's that, except for you and Zach, no other Aboriginal people are moving about in the film at all. So that even though there might be a sense of people suffering deprivation, all the other blackfellas are on country and they're sitting down. So they seem to be the only group of people in the film that there's a sense of permanence. Everyone else seems to be getting away from something or going somewhere, whereas regardless of the circumstances they find themselves in, there is a sense of connection to country in the film, a sense of reality that the Aboriginal mob of Barona and Birch are on their own land.
Stability, yeah.
Is that all you got to say? One word?
Well, I'm waiting for Noyce to react.
Well, they're on their own land, but remember they're living in a reserve. You know, so yeah, it's their land, but they've been herded there. You know, so I don't know what to say.
I mean, I would like to.
The reserve system was, you know, I suppose it can be looked at now with nostalgia, because most of it's been given over to local land councils, and it is Aboriginal land, but then it wasn't really. You know, they were controlled by managers who were draconian in the way they exerted their power. So, yeah.
Well,
I mean,
hang on, Foley.
country, yes, but
You can ask a question on that, because I take Phil's point, but what it seems to me is that there is what I would suppose is an absence of the historical outcome and reality of reserves. Is that Phil's right, that, and you know this about your own situation with people living on reserves prior to the referendum in '67, is that many Aboriginal communities in southeastern Australia that are now the strongest politically active communities, and we could think historically of Lake Tyers in Victoria and certainly Framlingham, but taking Phil's point in hand, the reality is still a lot of political organisation was able to be established around those same places of control and deprivation.
Well, I mean, it was situations like Birch and Barona. It was the intensity of the situation, as I think, captured a little bit in Backroads for people living on those reserves, was inevitably going to lead to strong leadership, like people like Essie and that came out of those communities and became really strong local leaders. And the other thing I want to just say, which occurred to me while we're talking about this, for people watching Backroads now as part of this film festival, I want you to bear in mind that every single Aboriginal person that is portrayed in this, that is in this film, apart from myself, are dead. They're no longer with us. And that in itself is an example of, or an illustration of the continuing disparity in life expectancy between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, you know. And that in itself is a really tragic, and that's one of the reasons why I find it so hard to look at Backroads and a lot of other films and stuff that I was in back in those days as well, you know. And that's just another tragic sort of aspect that people ought to take away from the film while they're watching it.
On that point, you know, Foley and I were born 12 days apart.
He's 12 days older than me.
I've been to a birthday party.
And now we're in a competition to see who can survive the longest.
I suspect the rich white fella in LA is more likely to last than me.
I don't know. The guy that rides that bike around, you know, Melbourne is probably the one that's going to.
Oh, this is true.
Okay, well, get back on your bike, Foley. That's all I can. Look, a couple of other questions. We've got about 10 minutes, but a couple other questions. I really do love the relationship between Jack and Gary, between you, Foley, and Bill Hunter. And I think it's wonderful because, you know, Jack exudes that sort of casual racism, particularly at the start of the film. And there is that genuinely sorrowful and poignant moment when he reflects on the only Aboriginal girl that he went out with and the terrible circumstances and what happens to that girl, the violence in the film. Sorry, not in the film, the violence that's referred to, is that it seems to me that what you're doing in the film with these two characters is carrying on or creating a conversation that's not being had. In other words, that what happens between Gary and Jack is a direct, honest conversation between a nominally, sort of ill-informed, racist white Australian and a very articulate young Aboriginal man. So when they're in that car and they're having those exchanges, it seems like that's the microcosm for a conversation that should have been taking place at a national level that wasn't taking place at the time. In other words, of people talking to each other.
I agree.
Thank you.
What do you say, Noyce?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was a conversation that we, the filmmakers, the official filmmakers, had very little control over. That was a conversation which they carried on day after day, scene after scene, amongst themselves. In that sense, it was like a documentary, shooting a documentary, as these two guys entering the personas they were, portraying, but taking their own thoughts and experiences and revealing them to each other and to us, the audience.
I think that one of the reasons why that worked was because Billy and I had known each other before making Backroads, and I knew that Billy knew the sort of person that he was required to portray in that film. And the other thing is that I had worked with Zach in Black Theatre in 1972-73, and I was a big admirer, a great admirer of Zach's acting and comedic skills. I still reckon that Zach was one of the best Aboriginal actors of his generation. So it was made a bit easier because we knew each other, and with minimal sort of discussion between ourselves prior to each shoot. I mean, we had a basic sense of what we wanted to say, and we just let it flow. And there was at least one occasion when I think Phil, probably one of the best scenes in the film, was lost when Billy and I did this long rave and then drove into this herd of black and white cattle. And I made a couple of comments that worked perfectly, but then we lost it in the lab, didn't we?
Yeah, we lost it. We went back and tried to shoot it. It was never the same.
It was spontaneous the first time,
Trying to do an improvisation. But let's conclude by talking about the ending, because the original. This was always going to be the most contentious point. The ending has been argued about for 45 years between Phil and I, independent of each other. This, like I said at the beginning, this is the first time I think that we've both sat together and compared our versions of why the ending was like it was. Come on, Phil, you give your version.
Hang on.
Sorry.
Just before you both go into it, my second last question is actually on the ending, because you can have the argument in a moment. But what I'm interested in is that it was so telling that watching the film again this time is that when Gary is hunted down and killed, he's not hunted down by the police alone. And in fact, there are a whole group of farmers, white farmers with the police who go up to the cave. And it's the fact that he is shot up by police and white farmers. And then someone says, who got him? The white farmer says, I think I got him. And then another white farmer, a young fella, says, we got the mongrel. To me, it stands for a real testament of colonial violence, and that is the combination of state police forces and white agriculturalists living on Aboriginal land who are in combination responsible for the history of violence against Aboriginal people. So I wanted to make that point, which you don't have to address because your argument might be far more invigorating.
Well, the questions have been asked here in America as they have been asked in Australia. Why is there such acrimony between cops and black people? And the reason in America, as the reason in Australia, is because the police force was there to protect the white folk from the black folk and to keep the blacks down. That's what they were there for, in both countries. So in that respect, the ending is very appropriate because it's historically accurate, although the original ending in the screenplay was that Gary and Jack drive the car onto the harbour bridge, where they get caught up in what was then an eternal traffic jam, and Gary gets out of the car and disappears, is swallowed up into the swarm of cars and people as he goes towards Sydney, which was symbolic of another idea, not as potent perhaps, but it was about the migration and the absorption of blacks into urban city society. But Gary wanted on screen.
Did he?
What? Say again?
Gary wanted to die on screen.
Which I now, 45 years later, realise was a mistake because it excluded the possibility of a sequel.
Yes. Although Foley, when Phil mentioned Sydney Harbour Bridge, he could have jumped off the bridge as the monkeys do in Head. But Foley,
just in terms of what the question that Tony asked, I mean, I hadn't sort of thought of it in that way until Tony interpreted it that way. But I said to Tony earlier today that was pretty much unintentional on our part, was it? I don't know what was in your head, Phil.
It wasn't intentional. We ran out of money. Here's the story.
Exactly.
We ran out of money. My family had a farm up there, and I thought, what are we going to do? We're out of money.
Potatoes out of your dad's farm.
I'll try and convince these guys. We'll go and live in the farmhouse. I'll try and convince these guys to stay another week because they're all threatening to leave, and I'll see what I can muster in a week to try and finish the movie, So I got my brother to come down with his car and dress up as a policeman, and basically, it was everyone said they've had enough because I couldn't pay them anymore, and so we came up with this ending, which
the farmers and the police were local yokels who you rounded up from around Wollombi, eh?
Like local yokels.
And
we only had 1 or 2 police uniforms, and the rest were locals. And so as much as it was a supreme statement, and was all worked out, it wasn't at all. It was just muster.
Unwitting.
Well, that's my expert analysis then, Foley.
That's right, mate. You're brilliant. You sound like an academic.
Just the final question. I mean, you can add anything you want to, but the final question I want to ask is, what do you think its place is in Australian film history today? Looking at the film today, how would you see the film, its importance?
I see the film as important because it's the first film in Australian history that gave Aboriginal people a little bit of a say in the way in which they were represented, and a little bit of control in the direction of the film, and that in itself sets Backroads apart from any other film for a long time after. So I think that, and also it led directly. I put it to you, it led directly to the making of Rabbit-Proof Fence by Noyce, because the woman who wrote it thought that Noyce had seen Backroads and thought that Noyce's treatment and working with Aboriginal people was the most sensitive she had seen, and she thought he was the blessed bloke to make Rabbit-Proof Fence. As a historian, I can construct these histories, Phil.
The place that has
While you think, let me tell one more story that's important about Backroads. Wait. Excuse me, Mr. Director. Excuse me, Mr. Director.
I'm hungry.
I can't say what place it has. That's for you to say.
And I said it. Now let me say this. Another story that ought to be told about the film is the story of the Mercedes-Benz that's driven it. The Mercedes-Benz that's in the film was worth more than the budget of the film. And when I was driving the thing, I didn't have a license, and they were real coppers at that moment who chased us there, who thought they were film stars. But Phillip kept on saying to me, now, Foley, don't you dare smash this car. If you smash this car, if you run off the road, we are up the old proverbial creek. Isn't that right, Phil? Whose car was it?
It was my brother's car.
That's right.
All right. I just want to say, I want to thank both of you very much for your generosity and good humour, and you didn't have an argument. Obviously, Foley wants another push bike, Phil. Actually,
I'm right, mate.
I think it is an absolutely stunning film, and watching it again yesterday for about the 8th time, I think what I love about Backroads is that each time I see it, I actually do learn something more. Yeah, for a film that's just under an hour long, there's a remarkable capacity to re-engage a viewer each time you see it. So obviously, I want to thank you for making it, and I want to thank you both for sharing the commentary on the film with the festival. And both of you take care, and we'll see who can get to 80. Okay? Bye.
No, thank you, Tony.